You guys really wanted me to review this monitor. I got so many requests and comments asking me about the 24G2U and how it compares to others I've reviewed. And it's pretty clear why it is so widely requested. Back when it came out in 2019, it was more or less the only 144Hz IPS monitor in its price range. But the landscape has changed, and the AOC is clearly not the only monitor with this feature set around the $200 mark anymore. I'm especially looking at monitors like the ASUS VG249Q and the MSI G241. Of course, we're gonna compare them to the AOC in this review. And what's especially interesting, it turns out that the 24G2U is not the same monitor that it used to be. AOC seem to have quietly changed the panel, and of course, we're gonna investigate on that. For those who are wondering about the difference between the 24G2 and the 24G2U, both are basically the same monitor, but the U version has a built-in USB hub and speakers, both of which the non-U version doesn't have. But the 24G2U, which I have right here, isn't available in every region, so some of you will have to go for the non-U version instead. But you're not really missing out on much, as the speakers sound pretty crappy, which actually is the case with most monitor speakers. And the speakers here are even on the lower end compared to other monitor speakers. They're still useful for quickly watching a tutorial or something without needing to grab your headphones. Design-wise, the U version is completely black, whereas some regions seem to have non-U versions with a silver stand. Completely black in this case, of course, meaning black with red plastic applications, which is a pretty common design choice for gaming branded monitors. I'm certainly not a big fan of red accents on a monitor, but at least AOC gave them a metallic look instead of using the typical glossy kind. I am, however, a fan of the ergonomics. The stand features a wide adjustment range for height and tilt, making even very low and extremely high positions possible. Swivel can be adjusted as well, though without a marking for the center position. Coding or reading documents can be done in portrait orientation if you wish doing so. Now, I really hate the menu navigation and the menu itself. There's really nothing good to say about that. There's no directional toggle, just 5 buttons, which are extremely hard to press without using your fingernail. I constantly turn off the monitor by accident, and the menu itself is cluttered and laggy. Fortunately, the 24G2U comes with its own control software, which also can be used to dial in most of your settings. This isn't the most intuitive software I've ever seen, but it gets the job done. For quickly and frequently changing settings like brightness, I much rather use software like Click Monitor DDC. The 24G2U is compatible with that, so you don't have to access the menu anymore after the initial setup. I'll link a guide on how to configure Click Monitor DDC for easy brightness control in the top right corner. Speaking of brightness, setting the monitor to 100% leads to just below 250 nits, which is a bit mediocre and can be too dim for daylit rooms. Turning the brightness all the way down leaves us with 79 nits, which is a decent value, though I wouldn't mind a bit more adjustment range on either end of the brightness scale. Setting the brightness to 38 leads to 140 nits, which is the brightness I used for most measurements. Interestingly enough, setting the brightness to 37 or 36 gives us exactly the same result, so only every 4th brightness step actually changes the brightness. The corresponding back level is 0.133 nits, leading to a contrast ratio slightly above the 1000 to 1 mark. That's pretty typical for an IPS panel and in the same ballpark as the ASUS VG249Q for instance. Though that's a good amount below the MSI G241, which almost hit 1500 to 1. Having a high contrast ratio doesn't really matter for gaming, at least not above a certain threshold. But for things like editing photos or watching movies, a higher contrast ratio is a huge plus. Now, especially the black bars you often get when watching movies or other video content annoyed me with the 24G2U. I was unlucky enough to get one with a bright spot at the top, which is pretty visible under normal conditions, but I hope you have more luck than me. Apart from that nasty hotspot, the backlight uniformity is actually pretty good and comparable to my unit of the ASUS VG249Q. Shifting from a black to a white screen, we get decent overall uniformity with an average deviation of about 9%. The right side of my monitor though is up to 20% darker than the center, which can be seen on close inspection, but this isn't apparent at a glance. I certainly hadn't any problems using this monitor for some casual editing. Now, this wouldn't be my first pick for content creation on a professional level, and this monitor surely isn't intended for that kind of stuff. We are likely looking at a 6-bit plus FRC panel here, and I was able to spot slightly more banding than I would expect from a true 8-bit display. I still would consider this monitor good enough for things like photo editing on a non-professional level though. Especially the color performance is pretty good, and even the out-of-the-box settings are surprisingly usable. After calibration and profiling, we're getting excellent accuracy, which is what we would expect from a good IPS monitor. As usual, you can download my ICC profile from the description down below, and I would recommend using these color settings in conjunction with that. By using my profile and settings, you clearly won't get the level of accuracy that can be achieved with individual calibration and profiling, but it's likely that you'll get a small improvement nevertheless. However, as I'll explain later, not all 24G2Us use the same panel, so make sure to use my ICC and settings only with the newer iteration of this monitor. Don't worry, this will all make sense in just a bit. But first, we'll take a look at the gamut coverage, for which the AOC scores a good result. Especially the important sRGB color space is completely covered, what's always good to see. Other than that, we're getting a color range somewhere between a standard and a white color gamut display. Along with that comes the usual oversaturation when viewing sRGB content without proper color management. And this is where the sRGB mode comes in handy. As we can see on the right, the out-of-the-box color gamut exceeds the dotted line, which represents sRGB. Especially greens and reds will be oversaturated. Activating the sRGB mode keeps the saturation in check. And the 24G2U actually does a good job here, showing professional level delta E's. Now the white point unfortunately is slightly off, but it's tolerable. The huge downside of this mode is that it disables the brightness control, leaving us with fixed 220 nits. So overall, the sRGB mode is usable, but I personally would much rather use the standard mode with an ICC profile instead and keep the brightness controllable. For color critical work, a program like Photoshop or Lightroom will support ICC profiles anyway, and for non-color critical stuff without ICC support, like gaming for instance, the oversaturation doesn't really matter that much and can even look pleasing. Speaking of gaming, I really enjoy playing somewhat competitive FPS on this monitor. In the past couple months, I've reviewed many 144Hz monitors around the $200 mark, and I'm constantly impressed how affordable a gaming experience like this has become. Now for tear-free gaming, we're getting adaptive sync up to 144Hz, and the 24G2U is compatible with both G-Sync and FreeSync, though owners of an NVIDIA graphics card need to use a DisplayPort cable to enjoy synced frames. You also have to take the extra step and enable G-Sync in the NVIDIA control panel, as this monitor isn't officially certified by NVIDIA as G-Sync compatible. In my testing with a 2070 Super, the G-Sync experience was absolutely flawless though. But 144Hz and adaptive sync are not worth much if the image becomes a smeary mess as soon as anything on the screen moves. Fortunately, the 24G2U has very responsive pixels, as we'll see in the pursued camera photos. By the way, you can go to testufo.com and do this test for yourself if you would like to compare your current monitor with this. The 24G2U provides 4 different strengths of overdrive, reaching from off to strong. And no, I'm not showing you the same picture 4 times. All 4 modes are virtually identical. But I'm not even mad, as the overdrive is pretty much tuned perfectly. If we're really pixel peeping here, strong might just be ever so slightly clearer, or that's just bias because it's called strong. Just for the good feeling, I would go with strong overdrive here, but it really doesn't make any difference. This behavior, by the way, is exactly the same whether FreeSync is turned on or off. Unlike with the Dell S2721 DGF for instance. It's the same story at 120Hz, and yet again the overdrive is spot on. Same with 60Hz, so just set it to strong, or actually you don't even have to, and you're done for every refresh rate. With or without FreeSync, it doesn't matter. But how does that compare to similar monitors? Well, here's the ASUS VG249Q delivering virtually identical performance. Don't mind the color difference, by the way, I was just using a different camera there, but other than that, these photos look basically identical. Therefore, it doesn't come by surprise that the MSI G24-1 is slightly lagging behind those two, showing a bit more smearing. Now, both the AOC and the ASUS deliver outstanding ghosting performance, even beating the TN panel of the Zowie XL2411K, though the Zowie has the edge when it comes to motion clarity. This is even more true when we factor in backlight strobing. The 24G2U allows pretty gradual control, having 20 different motion blur reduction settings, of which I obviously included only a few. MBR10 gives us a borderline usable mode, which at least is a bit better than what the ASUS and MSI have to offer. With the AOC, it looks like there still is at least some level of overdrive applied. This isn't user controllable though. Activating strobing on the 24G2U also deactivates the brightness control and adaptive sync and reduces the overall brightness quite a bit, which isn't very bright to begin with. And generally, MBR is lacking the refinement that Zoe has to offer with their diag mode. Therefore, I wouldn't recommend using strobing with the 24G2U. If you're a fan of backlight strobing, you should consider the Zoe instead. Now, the eagle-eyed among you might have spotted some pretty significant differences between my copy of this monitor and those that other reviewers have tested in late 2019 when the 24G2 initially came out. Both Hardware Unbox and PC monitors, for instance, have measured a much higher peak brightness than I did and a contrast ratio in the 1500 to 1 range, whereas my copy only got slightly over 1000 to 1. Of course, there's the usual inter-sample difference and we're not using exactly the same measurement devices and conditions, albeit PC monitors uses pretty much the same colorimeter under comparable conditions. And anyhow, those numbers are just way too different to be explained by simple variance. The different UFO photos paint a similar picture. Apart from a slightly different smearing behavior, pretty significant is that the overdrive modes on the other units are actually changing the overdrive characteristics, which mine does not. Now, the final nail in the coffin is that I got access to the factory menu, which clearly says that this is the FHB NG0 version of the popular TPM 238WF1 range of panels from TPV. And taking a look at PC Monitor's review, they state that their monitor uses a panel from Panda ending on LF1F. Quite likely, the other early reviewers like Hardware Unbox got the same panel given how similar their results are. And Tim from Hardware Unbox even said his unit uses a Panda panel. So there obviously has been a quiet panel change during the lifespan without any name changing or telling anyone. Quite interestingly, my 24G2U isn't the only monitor that uses this panel. Doing some detective work, I landed on an ASUS parts page where this panel can be bought. And checking for which monitors this panel is for, what a surprise! It's the VG249Q, which performed very similar to the AOC in my review. Interestingly enough, the VP249QGR spots the same panel as well, which I already suspected in my initial review, but I couldn't confirm that back then. No, I didn't mention that in my review, but the MSI G241 actually uses a panel from the same range as the AOC and both ASUS monitors. It's the TPM 238WF1 as well, but this time the LF1F version. That LF1F appendix is a strange coincidence given how similar it measures in terms of brightness and contrast to what others got for their early 24G2s. I wouldn't be surprised if those two panels were somehow related. But one of the big questions now is, which panel will you get when you buy an AOC 24G2U right now, or which panel does the one have you already got? Well, I can't know the answer for the first question, but I can show you how to find out which panel your unit has. First, make sure your monitor is turned on, then pull the power cord. Now press and hold down the menu button while plugging the power cable back in. Release the menu button when the image appears. Wait a few seconds and then press the menu button again. The menu will pop up on top of the screen and has a little F on its left side. Navigate left until the F turns red and confirm with pressing the menu button again. Then the factory menu will pop up. You probably can imagine that took me quite a few minutes of trial and error to find out that combination. Now the important bit obviously is the entry that shows the panel, which is the FHB NG0 version with my unit. I suspect early units will show a panel name containing LF1F instead. Please let me know in the comments which panel you got and how old your 24G2 is. Now that whole panel stuff was definitely a big surprise for me. I initially thought reviewing the 24G2U would be a bit boring as it already was so widely reviewed. Who could have thought that AOC quietly changed the panel, making this basically a completely new monitor? I'm not really mad at them as the new panel performs very good as well, though I have to criticize AOC for making such a massive change to a product without telling. If you like to get a monitor that performs more similar to the original 24G2U, I'd suggest taking a look at the MSI G241 instead, as it performs very similar in terms of maximum brightness and contrast ratio, and I would say even overall picture quality. And it seems that the response time characteristics are pretty similar as well, though keep in mind that I haven't actually tested the old 24G2U, so please refer to the reviews from Hardware Unboxed or PC Monitors to form an opinion about the old model. The newer iteration of the 24G2U actually performs extremely similar to the ASUS VG249Q, which is expected given they both use the same panel. This makes the new 24G2U one of the fastest monitors in its price class, even outperforming some TN panels. However, this comes with the drawback of a lower contrast ratio and a lower maximum brightness than what the MSI G241 has to offer. The ASUS has a slightly higher maximum brightness as well, otherwise the ASUS and AOC are highly comparable, so between those two it basically comes down to the pricing in your region. For the same price, I would ever so slightly prefer the VG249Q due to a bit more brightness headroom and a little less crappy OSD menu. Previously, the VG249Q was my #1 recommendation for a budget-conscious gaming monitor that absolutely excels in gaming while still maintaining good picture quality for content consumption and even some content creation. It now has to share this spot with the quietly refreshed AOC 24G2U. Thanks for watching and consider to subscribe.